On June 26, 1969, Alida Rosales hears her mother call her as they watch the Soviets land on the moon. Soviet astronaut Alexei Leonov takes the first step, saying it's for his country and the Marxist-Leninist way of life. In the USA, NASA and the public are devastated. Shane Baldwin gets ready for school after his mom calls him, while his father, Edward Baldwin, heads to work. At a NASA meeting, Deke Slayton announces Apollo 11's launch in 2.5 weeks, with the crew continuing their training. But he suggests everyone take the weekend off to recover from the shock. NASA's team gathers at the Outpost Tavern to blow off steam. Meanwhile, NASA Administrator Thomas Paine asks why the CIA didn't warn them about the Soviet mission. They discuss whether Apollo 11's launch can be moved up, but the moon's phase prevents it. At a press meeting, NASA explains Apollo 10 couldn't land because it didn't have enough fuel. Reporters try to get comments from astronauts like Ed Baldwin, but he criticizes NASA, leading to a heated discussion about the space program's direction. A month after the Soviet landing, Apollo 11 launches. Gene Kranz, the flight director, reminds the team of the mission's importance for the future of the US. Meanwhile, Alida and her father head toward the US-Mexico border. As Apollo 11 reaches the moon, technical problems cause a loss of contact with the crew, leaving everyone worried. After hours of silence, Neil Armstrong finally communicates that they've landed safely, bringing relief and celebration at NASA. Gene Kranz isn't confident about Neil Armstrong turning the lunar module Eagle vertically due to fuel concerns. He shares this with Wernher von Braun, but von Braun is sure it'll work. Neil and Buzz Aldrin are given the go-ahead and successfully rejoin Michael Collins in orbit. Edward Baldwin asks Deke Slayton when he'll fly again. Deke says it's unlikely, especially since von Braun is still upset with him. Realizing this, Ed knows he won't go back to space, and he loses his temper in his office. Meanwhile, von Braun faces pressure from the government to turn NASA's focus toward military space projects, but he refuses, arguing NASA should remain scientific. At home, Karen Baldwin tells Ed she can't handle the stress of him returning to the Navy, fearing he'll be shot down. Gordo Stevens, now dealing with his own issues at home, flies over his house in a jet, signaling his return to Tracy, his wife. Margot Madison, after receiving support from von Braun, moves to a new role in mission control, but faces teasing from her male colleagues. Later, von Braun admits to Margot that progress in space exploration isn't free, and that there were always costs, even hinting at darker moments in his past. As Apollo 12 successfully lifts off, Ed gets a visit from Deke, who offers him a role on Apollo 15, which Ed happily accepts. However, the excitement shifts when the Soviets land another astronaut on the moon, this time a woman, Anastasia Belikova, marking a historic moment for women worldwide. Gordo Stevens arrives at Gillespie Field in San Diego, greeting his friends Murph and Chatty. He bumps into Tracy Stevens, whom he met earlier. When she asks for flying lessons, he takes her up in a Cessna. Tracy shows her skills, revealing she has 745 flying hours. After landing, they kiss. Gene Kranz and Deke Slayton present General Weber with plans for an orbiting workshop, Skylab. But Apollo missions are now focused on military site surveys. Deke is unhappy about training women astronauts after the Soviets land the first woman on the moon, Anastasia Belikova. NASA is now tasked with sending a woman to the moon. Deke is introduced to two candidates from Mercury 13, Molly Cobb, a decorated pilot, and Patty Doyle, who passed Mercury tests with top scores. More candidates, including Danielle Poole and Tracy Stevens, join the program. Despite Deke's objections, the president insists Tracy represents America well. At NASA, Deke informs the 20 female candidates, including Tracy, of the challenging training ahead. During a jet test, Tracy impresses Deke by landing smoothly. Later, Molly Cobb proves her intelligence during a pop quiz, but expresses concern about the program's longevity. As training continues, Tracy struggles during a simulation with Molly and Danielle, leading to tension. Despite doubts about her ability, Gordo encourages Tracy to persevere. During a desert survival test, Tracy helps injured Ellen Waverly, earning Deke's respect. However, Deke advises her to drop out, but she refuses. By day 200, only 5 women remain. During a lunar module simulator test, Patty Doyle crashes and dies, leaving Tracy shaken but safe. After Patty Doyle's death, Molly Cobb sits at the Outpost Tavern. She is joined by Ellen, Tracy, and Danielle, who inform her she missed Patty's service. They try to comfort her, but Molly only speaks to say Patty should have ejected and that the program might be canceled. At home, Tracy discusses her astronaut training with Gordo, who reassures her that their kids admire her for it. They kiss and express their love. Ed Baldwin talks with Patty's angry father and smashes his phone in frustration after the call ends. His wife Karen consoles him, reminding him that Patty knew the risks of flying. At NASA, John Glenn expresses concern to Deke Slayton, implying that Patty wasn't prepared. Deke defends the women astronauts, saying they earned their place. Later, Gene Kranz presents findings of a Soviet crash on the moon, revealing that the Soviets are once again ahead. Deke holds a press conference on October 27, 1970, to announce that 4 women, including Molly and Tracy, completed astronaut training. This goes against NASA's decision to end the women's program. Danielle speaks with her husband, who's in Vietnam, while Ed teaches his son to ride a bike, but is interrupted by Deke, who informs him that Molly will replace Gordo on Apollo 15. Gordo, struggling with Tracy's success, drinks heavily, but later supports her accomplishment. As Molly prepares for Apollo 15, tensions rise. Ed gives her advice, but Molly, confident in her abilities, feels underestimated. During training, Molly clashes with Ed and Margot, leading to frustrations on both sides. On launch day, Apollo 15 successfully takes off, and Molly, thrilled, shouts, "I'm going to the moon!" Apollo 15 reaches the moon after 4 days, 3 hours, and 46 minutes. While Molly Cobb prepares to land, Deke Slayton and Margot Madison work at Mission Control. Shane Baldwin questions why his mom, Karen, is focused on Molly's achievement as the first woman astronaut, reminding her that Ed is the mission commander. Molly is asked how she feels about being near the moon and says it's humbling. Later, the crew is told ice is found on the moon, but it's far from their landing site at Mare Frigoris. Ed suggests landing at Shackleton Crater instead, but Gene Kranz declines, calling it too risky without proper gear. Despite objections, Ed shuts off communications and convinces Molly and Frank Sedgwick to agree. Pressure from higher-ups in the CIA, worried about the Soviets, pushes them to attempt landing at Shackleton. Mission Control gives them the final say, and they go for it. The Baldwin family watches the landing with friends, including Wayne Cobb, who shares concerns about Molly's safety with Karen. Ed and Molly successfully land on the moon, and they celebrate at Mission Control. Danielle Poole's husband, Clayton, returns from Vietnam, and Danielle reflects on her NASA role. She is excited to be selected for Apollo 18. Meanwhile, Tracy Stevens is assigned to Apollo 25. Tension builds between Wayne and Karen as they bond over their fears for Molly. On the moon, Ed and Molly find only rocks, but Ed leaves his son's name etched in the moon's dust. The crew finally discovers ice in Shackleton Crater, but is forced to return due to high oxygen use. They return to the LM safely, marking a successful mission. 2 years later, on October 12, 1973, NASA remotely lands its first moon base, Jamestown, on the edge of Shackleton Crater, preparing for Apollo 21. On August 24, 1974, Apollo 23 was set to launch, with Gene Kranz, the new Johnson Space Center director, wishing the crew luck. Commander Michael Collins humorously told Gene he would land better than Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin had. At Mission Control, Deke Slayton was reading the Apollo 24 crew list, naming Ellen Wilson as commander, Harrison Liu, and himself. Deke had been medically cleared for flight, but Administrator Weisner wasn't sure if the president would approve. Deke insisted, as chief of the astronaut office, that he would be on Apollo 24. Elsewhere, Karen Baldwin defended her son Shane and Danny Stevens at school over a prank. The principal suggested their behavior was concerning, but Karen brushed it off. At the outpost, Pam, Ellen, and Larry discussed the Equal Rights Amendment, with Larry doubting Americans would accept their daughters going to war, while Pam noted how people once said the same about women in general. As Gene Kranz was working on a rocket, an explosion engulfed him. At Mission Control, Irene Hendricks, the new flight director, witnessed Apollo 23's explosion on screen, freezing everyone in shock. 60 days after the explosion, the crew on the moon, Ed Baldwin, Danielle Poole, and Gordo Stevens continued their work, waiting for the investigation's outcome. The FBI suspected KGB sabotage, but found no conclusive proof. Margot Madison was tasked with collecting a report on the Saturn V explosion from Werner von Braun. During their meeting, von Braun revealed Margot's father had worked on the Manhattan Project, which deeply affected him. Von Braun also hinted that the contractor switch responsible for the Apollo 23 explosion was politically motivated to secure support for the Equal Rights Amendment. Margot eventually confronted Wisner, implying she had a copy of the report and could leak it unless she got what she deserved. The Apollo 22 crew, stationed on Jamestown for 86 days, hears from NASA that Apollo 24's launch will be delayed by 2 more weeks due to a mishap with a new LH-2 valve contractor. President Kennedy has been working on fixing the issues. After the call, Ed, Gordo, and Danielle pass the time watching an old show. Danielle, reflecting on her time in the space program, asks if her crewmates ever saw a therapist, leading to a discussion about their experiences. While cleaning up her ant farm, Danielle reflects on this further. On November 9, 1974, Danielle's husband, Clayton, struggles with job rejection, feeling he is more capable than his current situation suggests. His frustration leads to a tense moment before he leaves to clear his head. Meanwhile, Ellen Waverly faces pressure from FBI agent Gavin Donahue, who questions her medical history and the sexual orientation of her boyfriend Larry. Ellen pushes back against the intrusive questioning. Later, she discusses the situation with Larry and Pam Horton. Back at Jamestown, the astronauts encounter strange signals and deal with tensions arising from Gordo's growing frustration. Gordo's temper escalates when discussing mysterious blinking lights and ants he keeps seeing, leading to a physical altercation with Ed. On Earth, Karen Baldwin and Tracy Stevens argue with their children's principal over a perceived issue in their boys' friendship, which the principal views as problematic. Ellen's personal life continues to be scrutinized, as Administrator Wisner suggests that her and Larry's relationship should move forward to avoid scandal. As time goes on, Gordo's mental state worsens, culminating in a crisis. Ed eventually decides to send both Gordo and Danielle back to Earth for medical attention. Ed remains alone on Jamestown as he prepares for the arrival of Apollo 24. On December 14th, tragedy strikes Karen Baldwin's family as she returns home to find police informing her of an accident involving her son, Shane. Karen Baldwin is at the hospital, anxiously waiting for news about her son, Shane, who was hit by a car while riding his bike. A doctor informs her that Shane has severe head injuries and requires surgery due to a fractured skull and brain bleeding. Karen, in shock, tries to stay hopeful, thinking Shane is strong enough to survive. Meanwhile, Ed Baldwin is alone on the moon. He communicates with Danielle Poole, performs his tasks, and explores outside while taking pictures. Back on Earth, astronauts, including Danielle, watch TV where Gordo Stevens is praised for safely landing the crew from Apollo 22. Later, during an interview, Ellen Wilson, now mission commander, faces questions about women in space, but she defends her female colleagues. Gordo discusses his marital problems with a psychologist, feeling distant from his wife, Tracy. When Gordo tries to explain this to Tracy, she initially doubts him, thinking he's lying, until he shows her proof of his therapy sessions. Tracy, realizing her mistake, rushes to the hospital to support Karen, whose son is still in surgery. Ed, suspicious of Soviet activities on the moon, reports back to NASA that the Soviets seem to be building something underground. NASA advises him not to engage, though Ed strongly disagrees. The next morning, Karen receives the devastating news that Shane is brain dead due to the time it took for him to get to the hospital after the accident. Despite the doctor's explanation, Karen refuses to believe it and insists on getting a second opinion from NASA's top neurologist. At NASA, Margot Madison debates whether to inform Ed about his son's condition, but Karen insists they don't tell him until something more definite happens. Later, Ed receives a cryptic message from the Soviets offering sympathy for his son. Confused and angered, he destroys a Soviet monitoring device. Eventually, Karen has to tell Ed the tragic news about Shane. Ed, deeply shaken, turns to alcohol and self-destruction in his isolated state on the moon. Meanwhile, Karen begins making funeral arrangements, distancing herself emotionally from others, including her friend Tracy. Apollo 24 launched to rescue Ed Baldwin, who had been stranded on the moon for 159 days. Deke Slayton, Ellen Wilson, and Harrison Liu were on board, but the ignition failed. Gordo Stevens, in mission control, informed them that a flight control computer board was faulty, and Molly Cobb would deliver a replacement. Karen Baldwin is at home, grieving over her son Shane's death. She avoids visitors and struggles with her emotions. Tracy Stevens tries to support her, but Karen just wants to be left alone. On the moon, Ed, also grieving, creates a memorial for Shane using rocks. Alida Rosales deals with her father Octavio's anger after he finds out she's hesitant about attending the prestigious Kennedy School. He believes she's throwing away their sacrifices, suspecting it's because of a boy she's seeing. Molly Cobb prepares to assist Apollo 24. Meanwhile, FBI agent Gavin Donahue confronts Octavio, accusing him of using a false identity and possessing NASA photos linked to a suspected spy. Octavio denies any involvement but is arrested. Karen tries to cope by visiting Wayne Cobb, where they smoke marijuana and discuss life. Karen reflects on her distant relationship with Ed and her confusion about her future. Apollo 24 and 25 work together to repair the faulty equipment. But during the process, the booster ignites unexpectedly, killing Harrison Liu and injuring Deke. Molly Cobb gets disconnected and lost in space, but Tracy Stevens heroically manages to save her despite limited fuel. Ed encounters a Soviet cosmonaut at Shackleton Crater. The two briefly face off before Ed brings the cosmonaut inside Jamestown Base. However, Ed disables the airlock oxygen, rendering the cosmonaut unconscious. At Mission Control, they lose communication with Apollo 24, leaving the crew's fate uncertain as the spacecraft drifts off course. Ellen Wilson wakes up after Deke Slayton calls, urging her to abort their burn. He informs her his OPS is low and his suit has a puncture, but her abort handle is stuck and she can't reach Houston. Pulling a cord, she discovers Harry is lost in space. She manages to bring Deke aboard, but he has a stab wound from a damaged thruster. Ellen instructs him to apply pressure and tries to contact Houston again, but gets no response. On the moon, Ed Baldwin has Mikhail, a Soviet cosmonaut, bound and questions him about his presence in the mine. Mikhail asserts that the moon belongs to everyone, countering Ed's claims about territory. Back at Mission Control, Margot Madison checks on Apollo 24, but they remain out of contact. Ellen stitches Deke's wound while discussing their need for another burn to avoid losing lunar orbit. Deke reveals Harry was consumed by the plume. Alida Rosales receives a call from her father, Octavio, who is being sent back to Mexico. She leaves home, finds it trashed, and decides to flee after a warning from her father. As Deke's condition worsens, he reflects on his life and relationship with his wife, Marge. Meanwhile, Ed and Mikhail work together, deciphering Morse code signals. Ellen successfully retrieves a tank thrown by Ed, but when she returns, she finds Deke has died. Mourning his loss, she places Deke's pin at Shane's memorial. Ed leaves the moon, grieving as he returns to Earth. Later, Ellen emphasizes the importance of space travel despite its risks. In the post-credits, set in 1983, Ed and Karen watch a rocket launch, marking the expansion of Jamestown with a massive Sea Dragon rocket heading to the moon.